Welcome to the Amherst History Society and one of our weekly talks, lunch buddies we call them, on history. Thank you very much for coming. Before I introduce our speaker, we're going to be videotaped today by Amherst Media. Mariah is back there and an intern at the station. Paul Berman is our speaker, and he's a retired physician, and he's speaking today on the reminiscence of a Union naval officer in the American Civil War, the letters of Fredrick William Strong to Catherine West Strong, 1861, 1865. One other interruption. I was here Friday doing some work, and we got a call from Wisconsin from a lady who is living in the Strong house out there, and then so that got us started, and that's the reason why I was here. Paul Berman.
Okay. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the reminiscence of Fredrick William Strong, and I'm going to basically just take parts of the reminiscence. The actual reminiscences are about 200 pages long. They are right now housed at the archives at the Jones Library, although I understand they will be on display here starting May 3rd. So from 1861 to 1865, Fredrick William Strong, who lived from 1834 to 1907, wrote letters to his wife while serving as an officer in the Union Navy. As he noted, quotes, "I did not keep a connected diary during the war to which I may refer, but my letters to my wife were frequent and generally touching upon such matters of interest as occurred, and I am desired to preserve in this way such extracts from them as may be of interest to my children. They're presently in their infancy." So he wanted to leave this for his children. He would serve as a executive director aboard a USS Cambridge, which is a warship, from 1861 to 1864, and then he would be a gunboat commander on the USS Azalea from 1864 to the end of the war. He was born in Ipswich, Massachusetts on January 4th, 1834, and he's the son of Simeon Strong, and that's the connection to this house. Simeon Strong lived in this house, and Rachel Lee Smith, who was Simeon Strong's wife. He was one of 6 children. His 3 brothers all served in the Navy. 2, Henry Strong and Frank Lee Strong, actually served with him aboard the USS Cambridge. And one of the brothers was born here in Amherst, but father moved around. He was a physician, he moved around quite a bit, and that accounts for sons being born in different towns. His 3rd brother, Edward Trask Strong, rose to the rank of Rear Admiral in the Spanish-American War. So it was quite a family. He also had 2 sisters, Louisa and Lucy, of which you really cannot find much about. He married in May 4th, 1861, to Catherine West of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Cambridgeport, and they had 3 children. Following the Civil War, he moved to Burlington, Wisconsin, where he became a station agent. And then he died in 1907. Now the manuscript's not a transaction of the extracts. It's not a transcription of the extracts from his letters. This manuscript was not. For as I read the reminiscence, I found them to be quite repetitive. Life on the blockade was, for the most part, monotonous, having to constantly patrol a large area of the coastline, hoping to intercept blockade runners. And when a contact did occur, it was far from monotonous and quite horrific, actually. Fredrick went to sea in December of 1851 at the age of 18, and he was a member of a number of ships over the course of time until about April, or until about January of 1861, when he was commander of his own ship. And he arrived in New York City on April 13th, 1861 in command of a boat called the John Haven, which was out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But he had just completed an around-the-world trip, basically. And he'd been away from what was happening in the United States in terms of news.
April 13th,
Yeah.
That's today.
Yeah. His first assignment, I'll just skipped here. Okay, so he docked unloading cargo, and he learned about the fact that that Fort Sumter had been fired upon, and New York was in a furor, as he said, of excitement. In early August 1861, with increasing hostilities and a need for a larger navy, he applied for a commission in the Navy, and he did receive one as acting master, which is the person who's head of navigation. It's not the commander of the ship, but he was basically the leading executive officer. And he was ordered to duty on the USS Cambridge, which was fitting in the Boston Navy Yard. And she was the first blocking gunboat which left Boston, and was the first one to arrive on the southern coast. So this was an early blockade. He, as I said, was acting master, a job which entailed being the navigator and sailing master. And he had a lot of background, 10 years of sailing. He was subsequently, as I said, promoted to executive officer, and in 1864, as I mentioned, he became commander of a gunboat, which is a much smaller boat. But both these boats were assigned to the Atlantic Blocking Squadron, their station being primarily off the coast of North and South Carolina. I'll just mention the Cambridge was about 858 tons, a two-masted square-rigged schooner. She was 200 feet long and 32 feet wide, not much, and only had a maximum speed of 10 knots, so quite slow. And she carried a complement of 225 officers and seamen, so it was pretty crowded on board a ship, as you can imagine. I just want to point out that on April 19, 1861, a week after the Civil War began, Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of the Confederate States from North Carolina to the Rio Grande, the so-called Anaconda Plan, because it was shaped like a snake. When Virginia seceded, the blockade was extended to the Potomac. And to enforce the blockade, which covered a large area of about 3,000 miles, containing 189 harbors, they obviously needed more ships and a larger navy. However, it was soon discovered that they could concentrate on the large cities, and they didn't need that many ships. So they concentrated on Charleston, Wilmington, and Savannah, for example, which cut down the number of the needs. Now, just as an aside, the average sailor recruited was about 26 years of age, and mostly came from the eastern part of the United States, mostly came from New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. And they were primarily a large segment of the working class who enlisted, and they were usually skilled tradesmen such as butchers, bakers, coopers, people who made barrels. There were also a large foreign contingent, primarily Irish, on board. I just want another note. In between the excitement of capturing ships, which I'll get to in a minute, the possibility of prize money, the crew and officers suffered months and sometimes years of stark isolation and crushing monotony. The round-the-clock nature of the job caught most men by surprise. The watch was constantly scanning the horizon for small boats, usually at night, without the moon, which was the best time to run the blockade. And the blockaders had no lights, and there were no lights ashore. And so even for sailing for the blockers was quite dangerous in terms of shoals, obstructions. There were many false alarms and many boats running without lights, as I said, and collisions with other boats at night proved a relatively commonplace event, both Union and Confederate. But mostly Union, because the blockade runners were much faster. They were 20 knots they could run at, whereas, as I told you. The average blockade sailor served 6 to 9 or 18 months without breaks and without leaving their ships. Desertion was a problem, but it was difficult to desert when you're in the ocean. There was, a cold desertion. Anyways, September 4th, 1861, the Cambridge was commissioned and sailed from Boston. And as Strong says, quotes, "We are just entering Chesapeake Bay and will soon be at Fortress Monroe." And this is the larger map. Fortress Monroe is outside of Richmond. So here's, it's in Virginia. And what this map is a close-up of Hampton Roads. And Hampton Roads is the harbor where Fortress Monroe was the guarding fort. And basically, the green here is the Union side, and the gray here is the Confederate side. And Fortress Monroe, actually, the way the setup was, both Richmond and Newport were basically cut off. So they entered the Fortress Monroe. Mail will be sent ashore because this is where they could get their mail from. And we anchor, so I must make a haste to write a few words. We had a pleasant passage as far as the weather was concerned, but all hands are extremely busy and we shall be glad to get in. He says, "I have a fine crew and they look well today, dressed in white frocks and blue trousers." Now, he then so on the 8th of September they sail. We lie 3 miles from Sewell's Point. That's Newport Point. Sewell's Point is off, where the enemy have heavy batteries guarding the approaches to Norfolk, and where we can see the soldiers walking on the beach. There are steamers, going to and fro from the camp. Occasionally a shell is thrown towards us. I passed here 2 years ago on my return from an unlucky voyage, and I little thought that I should, upon my next visit to the old Point Comfort, come to fight the same men who then showed me all possible kindness because I was a Massachusetts man. Tomorrow morning we leave here to the blockade entrance to Beaufort, North Carolina. And this is Fort Monroe, and he is headed for Beaufort, which I didn't underline. So on September 9th, 1861, left Hampton Roads early this morning, went off Nag's Head. We captured the British schooner Louisa Agnes of Lunenburg with a cargo of fish. We took the captain and 3 men out of her, leaving 2 on board, and sent her in charge of the prize crew to New York. A day later, off Cape Lookout, we took another schooner. She is sure a prize, but not of much value. Now, and we put what's called the prize crew on board. So one of the big attractions of blockade sailors was the possibility of winning prizes for capturing ships. For example, the USS Alias seized the Hope off Wilmington in late 1864, and the captain won $13,000, or basically $181,000 by today's. The chief engineer got $77,000. The seamen got $1,000 each, so And the cabin boy even got $500. In another example, the USS Alligator captured the Memphis and was rewarded $510,000, which would be well over about $6 million in today's cost.
Were the rewards paid by the government?
Yes, the rewards were paid by a committee set up by the government, and there were very strict rules about the payment of the reward. And it also depended both on the cargo of the ship, but also, interestingly enough, on the treatment of the crew. If the crew of the captured ship were not treated properly, the reward was much less. So, the blockade runners were aiding the Confederacy, but they weren't members of the Confederacy.
Right.
They came primarily from British ports. They came through Bermuda primarily. They also came from the Caribbean islands, Havana in particular. As I said, in September 24th, 1861, Fred talks, I'm using Fred for his name, that's unusual. Strong talks about the monotony, as we mentioned, of our life. Our life was relieved by the morning of a little episode in which I was the principal actor. One of the officers, a young man of 25 from New Bedford who had developed typhoid fever, became delirious. He jumped out of his bed, grabbed some guns, stormed into the steerage, and threatened to shoot all who were there, which was quite a number of people. The crew managed to escape and asked Strong, as the master of the ship, one of the jobs, to intervene. And I was called to see him, found him sitting on a sea chest with 4 Navy revolvers, one of which was pointing at me. Strong thought after some discussion that he had had the situation under control, when, quotes, "Look out," and bang, bang went 2 barrels at me. One of the balls missed my head by 2 inches. The mark of the other can't be found. The disillusioned crewman was finally subdued by the crew and returned to his bunk, but his outlook was very poor. And 2 days later, in the afternoon of the 26th, Strong was called to see this gentleman and stood by his bedside, saw the last faint gasp, saw the eyes close to all earthly scenes, went again upon our flooded deck with a saddened heart. Death is at all times a painful sight, but when the soul leaves its frail tenement amid the howling of the tempest and the roaring of the angry sea, for some reason then he never finished this. He just mentioned that the body was committed to the deep. Now, there was no mention by Strong of a physician being available to take care of this man, but there were physicians, surgeons on board the ships, and particularly the flagship. That was where the admiral was. The Navy did have a chief of the U.S. Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, a Dr. William Wayland. He had been responsible for the construction of naval hospitals at Annapolis, as well as Memphis and New Bern, North Carolina. He established the Naval Laboratory in Brooklyn, where they produced chloroform and ether, which was the anesthesia. They used primarily chloroform in the field, and the Army did, primarily because ether is highly inflammable. It's interesting, he also developed the first Navy hospital ship in 1862, which actually was on the Mississippi on the western part. It was called the USS Red Rover.
Come over.
And come over Red Rover, maybe that's where that comes from. This ship featured 2 operating rooms and was staffed by female nurses. There's no mention, Now, just to mention, disease was a major killer in the Civil War, both on land and sea. On any one boat, about, quotes, 5% of the crew reported sick each day, and an extremely small number of seamen went ashore to the hospital for treatment. Of the 4,588 Union sailors who died during the war, 2,784 perished from illness. with yellow fever, malaria, and typhoid playing the big roles. Little bit different than the roles that involved the Army, which I'm not going to get into much detail. Now, just to give some background on medical practice at the time of the Civil War, and I think this quote really sums it up, what medical practice was like. Quotes, "A hodgepodge of ancient shibboleths, folk remedies, and sound scientific practice." It kind of covers it. The basic theory of medicine at the time was what's called the miasma theory, which had dated from the time of Galen, which was 129 AD. And the cause of disease was believed to be bad air, unhealthy places, or trauma. And disease was kind of equal to a natural imbalance in the body. There was no knowledge of bacteria. There was no knowledge of antibiotics. Pasteur in 1860, that was so a year before the Civil War, Pasteur was just beginning to discover the role of bacteria. Lister in 1867 was developing his theory of asepsis, so that, for example, surgery in the Civil War, you didn't wear gloves, you didn't wear a mask, you wore a gown maybe to protect yourself from getting the gore on your beautiful outfit. You didn't wash your hands. You went from case to case operating because there was no concept of what we call asepsis. And interestingly enough, even after Lister published his papers in 1867, people were very skeptical about this, and it took years for it to become a standard, the gold standard, shall we say, in medical practice. The same for the germ theory. The germ theory really wasn't universally accepted till the late 1890s, and then, of course, things exploded. As I said, anesthesia was available in ether and chloroform, but chloroform was the primary one used. Early on, there were cases where anesthesia was not used. It depended on the field hospital and supplies, and that was a big problem. Surgery was limited to extremities, lower and upper extremities, but if you got shot in the chest or in the abdomen, nothing could be done. They just didn't do thoracic surgery or abdominal surgery at that time. As I said, there were no antibiotics, there were no such thing as IV fluids. Post-operative infections were quite abundant and probably accounted for a pretty good size of the death rate. As I said, disease was the major mortality, and just to give you an overall concept, the Union suffered about, and there's recently been talk about upping this number, but suffice it to say, the Union suffered about 360,000 deaths, of which close to 250,000 were due to disease. And primarily typhoid, dysentery, malaria, yellow fevers kind of down the way. The Confederates had about 260,000 deaths, of which about 186,000 were due to disease. Now, October 11th, 1861. That evening, quotes, "We have a good deal of sport with our contrabands." Contrabands are African American slaves. "Get them to dance and sing plantation songs. They appear to be perfectly happy and contented and are willing to work day and night as such employment as they are capable of performing. However, they don't like to sing Dixie." Now, contrabands, as I said, were African American slaves. And the word contraband came from General Benjamin Butler, who used international law to justify keeping them. Basically declared that slaves were the property of the enemy and subject to confiscation. Prior to this, according to the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, runaway slaves were to be returned to their masters, and he argued that refusing to return them to their owners would deprive the enemy of valuable labor. And by December of 1862, the Navy took a step and basically said that the contrabands could be enlisted into the U.S. Navy, the Union Navy, as landsmen, and also could be seamen. So now the other reason the contrabands or the slaves were useful was that since they came from these islands, especially the inland waterway area, they were, many of them, excellent in terms of navigation. And the Union used them for helping them to navigate the waterways. They could also tell you where the Confederate troops were located, so they were a great store of knowledge in this regard. Now on March 8th, 1862, this is when the Merrimack showed up. And I put this is where the Cambridge was sitting. And the Merrimack came around the corner here, and I'll get into the discussion. But because he was sitting back around, if Strong's ship had come around that point, we wouldn't be talking today about reminiscence, because he would have been destroyed. During the evening of the 8th, when the Merrimack showed, the Congress was set afire. That's this ship right here. And burned until 1 o'clock when she blew up. This is him talking. I never saw such a sight as she presented when burning, and the spectacle of the explosion was magnificent. Kind of a strange use of words, but the saddest of all was the loss of the Cumberland. And the Cumberland is right here. So he was here. Cumberland was basically one of their sister ships. Was the loss of the Cumberland. These two ships lay near together where they did last fall when we were up there, and the Merrimack went for them first. And after pounding broadsides after broadsides through the Cumberland at close quarters, she ran her down, sinking her immediately with the loss of 150 men, all her wounded going down with her. So, some of her crew got down to the fort this morning and say they fought until the last moment and jumped out of the ports overboard as the ship was sinking. The officers, those who survived, were taken prisoner, but the crewmen were allowed to go on shore. On March 9th, the Monitor showed up, and it took on the Merrimack, and Strong observed that this is the first engagement that has taken place between iron-plated ships, and it shows how ineffectual wooden vessels are in opposition to them. And I don't want to get into the discussion. The Merrimack and the Monitor battled it out to some people say a stalemate. And then on June 13th, 1862, he was ordered to the new inlet near Wilmington, North Carolina. So I'll take this down. Maybe I can put this up here. Hopefully it falls over. So the new inlet is right here at Wilmington. Now, Wilmington was the most difficult place to blockade. However, it was also the most popular station and was dubbed the prize money command because so many blockade runners were seized there attempting to leave Wilmington. The two entrances, and I'm sorry I don't have a blow-up of the two entrances, to the Cape Fear River. So the Cape Fear River is basically right here. Wilmington is not on the coast. Wilmington is up the Cape Fear River. There are two entrances, the Cape Fear River. To the east, the New Inlet or Swash Channel, and to the southwest, the Western Bar. And although they were only 10 miles apart, they had Smith Island and Frying Pan Shoal lying between them, a distance separated the distance of 40 miles of water. And James Sprunt, who wrote a book called The Tales of the Cape Fear Blockade, gives a beautiful description of what it must have been like at the Cape Fear. I'll just try to quickly read it. Together, this is Cape Fear, the water. Together they catch the long, majestic roll of the Atlantic as it sweeps through 1,000 miles of grandeur and power from the Arctic towards the Gulf. It is the playground of billows and tempests, the kingdom of silence and awe, disturbed by no sound save the seagull's shriek and the breaker's roar. It's desolate and terror. Imagination cannot adorn it. Romance cannot hallow it. Local pride cannot soften it. There it stands today, bleak and threatening and pitiless. And this is where they spent 4, 5, 6 months at this station. Now, October 3rd, 1862, Strong states, we brought down 59 Confederate prisoners from Buford, part of the garrison of Fort Macon. So Buford had been captured, and they had brought down the prisoners, who are to be exchanged. I went to Fort Fisher in my boat and with a flag of truce and made arrangements to have a tug sent for them. I was met by a major and a captain also in a boat, for they would not allow me to land. The interview was pleasant enough, and they say that smallpox and yellow fever are raging violently in Wilmington, 25 dying per day. Also have fever at the fort. Now these were civilians, this is not Confederate soldiers. It says contrabands are coming off in large numbers and tell the same story. Say the fever was brought by the steamer Kate, USS Kate, which ran in a few days ago, and say that she ran in purposely, knowing she had it. Kind of saying that there was biological warfare of sorts, so that it might spread ashore. And she lies in sight of us at quarantine with all her crew dead from yellow fever. Now, yellow fever had an impact out of proportion to mortality because of its concentration of death within the span of a few weeks, and the horror and rapidity of its course. In Wilmington, the Cape was blamed as the source of the yellow fever. Physicians studying epidemics at this time were impressed by the fact that the earliest cases of yellow fever could all be traced to ships arriving from yellow fever-infested Caribbean ports. So the assumption was that yellow fever was being brought in this regards. Today we know that yellow fever is caused by a virus transmitted through the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is the vector, as opposed to the mosquito that causes malaria, which is Anopheles. The yellow fever insects breed in fresh water, favor cisterns, puddles, buckets, and flower pots. Therefore, yellow fever tends to be an urban disease and disdains swamps and lakes. So malaria tends to be a rural disease, and yellow fever, urban disease. The crew of the Cape probably were infected while at the port in the Caribbean and were dying as they sailed towards Wilmington. They were not contagious. Simple contact with them would not pass the disease. One needed the presence of the vector, the mosquito. But of course, at that time, they didn't understand that. So that, for example, when the contrabands came on board the USS Cambridge from Wilmington, they were stripped of all their clothes. They were scrubbed down. The clothes were thrown away because the assumption was that it could be also carried in the clothing. And then they were given clothing on board ship. The U.S. Navy's approach to yellow fever, which is the standard approach, was quarantine, and basically set up a system by which ships could not land. If a ship had a patient with yellow fever on board, they weren't allowed to land for 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And that still holds today. in certain parts of the world where there's yellow fever, you're not allowed to go there. You can get a yellow fever vaccine. Today we have a yellow fever vaccine, so you have to have the vaccine before you go to these areas. Otherwise, you get quarantined. Australia has this very strict quarantine rules for yellow fever. Because if you have yellow fever, and if the mosquito is there, mosquito bites you, and the mosquito carries yellow fever, can bite somebody else and perpetuate disease. And there have been some major epidemics. And the concern actually by the Communicable Disease Center in Atlanta is that someday we may see an outbreak of yellow fever in the South again, providing this population of mosquito comes. Anyways. Things are kind of monotonous over 1863, and in 1864, March 3rd, Strong experiences a personal tragedy. Quotes, "Henry, my brother, is quite sick tonight. Has a bilious attack. His lungs are oppressing him badly, and I brought him aft to my stateroom. Dr. Granger, there was a surgeon on board, thought this morning he would have pneumonia, and there is danger of it. But the infection worsened, and on the 11th of March, my brother, Henry S. Strong, died of typhoid pneumonia. He had joined the ship in 1863, and thus had been 11 months on board. He held the position of yeoman and was 22 years of age." Now it's interesting, Strong did not want to bury his brother at sea, and took the unusual step to take the body ashore immediately. He wanted to take it on shore, but he couldn't. So he took the unusual step of asking one of the carpenters to, quotes, "make a heavy box of 2-inch plank, airtight. And then he found a barrel of lime on board, which I shaked and cooled into the box. The body was placed in a series of thick blankets. With this arrangement, Strong was able to keep his brother's body intact, and made arrangements to have him shipped to North Andover, Mass., where he was interred in the family plot. Strong then was given time off to attend his brother's funeral.
Oh, excuse me. Can I go back to the yellow fever?
Yes.
Was there how were they treated other than quarantine? Was there any known cure at all, or?
No. So they were given various herbs, lots of fluid, and basically, if you didn't have a large dose of the virus, you would survive. If you had a large dose, you died. There wasn't any medication. And as I said, there were no IV fluids, so there was no fluid support either for these individuals. On May 4th, 1864, Strong, now a gunboat commander, received orders from Washington to report to the Boston Navy Yard for command of the USS steamer Azalea, which was a gunboat. She was a small vessel built in Philadelphia. She carried about 56 officers and men. On June 6th, with all supplies on board, he sailed for the blockade in Charleston, South Carolina. And he had difficulty getting out of the Vineyard Sound because a small boat and lots of bad weather. But he tried again on June 8th, and quotes, "It had been blowing heavily all day from the southwest. With cold, chilly air, I got past Gay Head Light last evening and was off Montauk Point light by midnight, but there was a bad chopping head sea, and she is so low in the water that it swept her decks fore and aft. Could make but little headway against it. Got to Woods Hole. This is a queer little place." Love that. "A hole among the rocks in one of the Elizabeth Islands with a dozen or so homes. It is a handy little harbor with good water. These islands are usually used mainly as pastures, and many sheep are kept there." Finally, on June 17th, he was able to get to station and arrived off Charleston. A very rough passage from Cape Henry until we passed Cape Hatteras. My compasses have troubled me. So on the 22nd of June, my station at night is to cruise from the inner buoy of Rattlesnake Shoal. So he's here at Charleston. Charleston, again, is not on the coast. And Fort Sumter's out in the harbor. And around Fort Sumter is something called Rattlesnake Shoal. It's a very dangerous shoal in the water. So he's cruising there across the channel to Sullivan Island. I can go according to the darkness of the night. The whole shore is lined with enemy batteries. Got off my station last night, away outside, by not allowing the ebb tide, and the flagship opened fire on me, the Union flagship, because didn't know who he was. Thought me a blockade runner. I'm finding out about my compass errors, and will be able to get about in the dark before long. But basically this was like friendly fire, as we know it today. Again, because there were no lights. There was nothing out there. It's amazing to me that they got along as well as they did. On the 9th of July, Strong saw action as they captured a little prize last night, the first one we had taken in the past 5 months. And then he talked about well, he captured another ship. He fired one shot at the ship. I'll just run through this quickly. I took him in tow, my station, and kept my station until daylight when I took him in. Captain says the cargo belongs to him. He has his wife with him, a pretty young woman, married only 3 weeks ago. Quotes, rather an unpleasant honeymoon. They had all sorts of excuses, the blockade runner. You know, they'd be off course by 300 miles. You had to ask them what they were doing there. It's getting late, so in January of 1865, Strong wonders how many more years will find us in the blockade. This is the 4th, a long time to be rolling about here watching sandy beaches. I have been at home but 3 months in the last 4 years. The general opinion seemed to be that the coming of spring campaign will crush the rebellion, and then we can all go home. I'll just skip ahead. Then on the 21st of February, Strong wrote to his wife, "You will have heard before reading this the glorious news that Charleston is in our possession again." He said the whole city of Charleston seemed to be on fire. Large volumes of smoke covered it. At about 9 o'clock, a heavy explosion in the upper part of the city threw a column of flames and smoke, without exaggeration, a half-mile high and probably more. It was a beautiful sight. It looked like a straight, well-proportioned pillar of fire, say 200 feet in diameter. We supposed it to be a powder magazine exploding. But the town itself is a forlorn-looking place, the town, the picture of desolation and ruin. Looks as though no one was lived there for 40 years, all rusty, ragged, and decayed. Along the wharf, nearly half the buildings have great yawning holes in them, and the wharves are covered with dirty, ragged people looking at us. And I think if anybody's ever seen the pictures of Charleston, there are lots of books. On the 11th of March, 1865, quotes, "I've learned today that I have a little daughter at home, born February 26th. So he was quite active when he was home. And at that time, on the 27th of March, he receives new orders. Proceed to Port Royal, which is... and from Port Royal, he then gets, he's not happy about the assignment. He says, "This is simply barbarous, excuse me. I shan't get a mail once a month. They have given me the worst and most difficult duty ever since I've been here. Put me on the inside blocking station under the batteries because the vessel was low in the water and could not be seen as well as the rest. Kept us running dispatches because she's fast and a good seaboat, and now they send me into exile. So he was not happy about his assignment. But 2 days later, he received orders from the admiral, and the orders were, I have every occasion to believe that Jeff Davis will attempt to escape from Florida coast to Cuba. You will therefore proceed and be vigilant in examining the coast allotted to you to ascertain the presence of any vessel that could serve the contemplated purposes. I hardly need to point out to you the interest that attaches to this duty. Catch the rascal alive, if you can. But he must not escape. Allow no foreign vessels to give shelter to him. So following these orders, he was sent to Fredrick, just above Jacksonville. Off St. Simon's Sound, I left Charleston last night for St. Augustine, Florida, 200 miles, and now I'm running down the coast. It is believed that Jeff Davis will attempt to escape from the coast, and several of us are sent to guard these entrances. On May 1st, off St. Augustine, Mosquito Inlet to the southward, and another up north, making about 50 miles of coast we have to guard. Mosquito Inlet is known today as the Ponce de Leon Inlet. It's a natural opening in the Barrier Islands in northern Florida that connects the north end of the Mosquito Lagoon and the south end of the Halifax River to the Atlantic Ocean. Anyways, as you know, or don't know maybe, that Jefferson Davis was captured, I believe in Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia.
Huh? And yes, Davis was captured in Tybee Sound, Georgia, sent to guard, was captured. And so there was no need for, so that on June 8th, 1865, he got his final orders, and that was to proceed to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There was granted leave for 4 months, went home, and at the end of that time I received honorable discharge from the U.S. Navy. So, as I said, after leaving the service, he moved to Wisconsin, where, as I said, he worked for the railroad as a station agent, and he was also listed as a painter. And then after that, if you follow the census, it's difficult to figure out exactly what happened, but he died probably around 1907. His place of burial is not known, sadly. The reminiscence of so in summary, the reminiscence of Fredrick William Strong, based on extracts of letters home to his wife, illustrate the life of a Union blockade naval officer and subsequent gunboat commander during the American Civil War. The monotony of serving in the blockade squadron was exhibited over and over again. He recorded his thoughts about command decisions, the terrors of war, the near misses with the Monitor and the Merrimack. As I said, had he moved around that point that I illustrated, why we wouldn't be talking today. There was the battling not only of the enemy, but the winter seas off Cape Hatteras in South Carolina, where ships ran out of supplies, engines broke down, bottoms became fouled, and storms blew blockaders off station. Shores, as I said, were unlighted, full of shoals, as well as man-made obstructions. In his letters, Strong conveyed his thoughts about the toll of war on the southern cities of Buford, North Carolina, and Charleston. He vented his anger about the pointless burning of Darien, Georgia. I didn't bring that out, but that was part of it. The many bunglings of the Union military. Throughout his reminiscence, he talks a little bit about the big errors that were made both in the Army and the Navy. He exhibited his compassion for others, the poor delusional man with typhoid, saving his brother from burial at sea, and his constant wish to be home with his wife and children. These are but a few examples of Strong's experiences with the Atlantic Blocking Squadron of the Union Navy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul.